Thank you all so much for coming. We greatly appreciate it. I'd like to introduce my co-editor, Steve D'Alessandro, who'll be presenting with me today. And depending on where you are in the world, it's either good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Regardless of where you are, we're grateful that you've taken the time to be here to learn about reviewing for the Journal of Consumer Behavior. We hope our presentation today is helpful to you, both for those interested in reviewing, but also in talking about what we're looking for with reviews. We're hoping it will also be helpful to you as authors to sort of see how papers are looked at on the review end. And we have Dr. Raj Iyer is going to be working our chat. So as we go through the presentation today, as questions come up, please type them in the chat. And then Raj will be able to probably answer most of the questions as we're going through the presentation. But if not, we're going to leave plenty of time at the end for questions. So what we're going to talk about today is I want to briefly introduce the JCB team. We have some of our associate editors with us and just give you some background on the journal. Then I want to talk a little bit about the benefits for reviewing. Then my co-editor, Steve D'Alessandro, is going to talk about some suggestions and what JCB is looking for specifically with reviews. And in handling reviews, there's sort of two parts of it. The initial review, but then seeing that manuscript through the process. So how do you handle it as a reviewer when revisions come in? Because it's vital if you review for a manuscript that you stick with the manuscript throughout the review process. And then finally, I'll come in and to wrap it all up and we'll have questions. We have a wonderful team. I'm going to briefly introduce, we have a few of our associate editors here. We have Zach from University of South Australia. We also have Raj Iyer from Bradley University. And we have Varsha from Micah. And some of our AEs are teaching right now, so they're unable to make it. But the thing that's really wonderful about the Journal of Consumer Behavior is that we are truly an international journal, both in terms of our mix of associate editors, but also with our editorial review board and our advisory board, that we have representation throughout the world. And our editorial review board is a true working board that we expect our ERB members to review 4 to 6 articles annually. So it's a true working board. Now, when you can see why are we looking to expand our group of reviewers for the journal, you can see that our submissions are going up. And we estimate for 2022 that we're going to get about 1,400 articles. So we've seen tremendous growth in the journal. Our latest citation number was 3.19 for 2021. Our papers are read. That when you look at for 2022, our downloads are up 20%. So papers that are published in the journal are truly read and have an impact, and they're cited. Our citations for 2022 are up 30%. So we're seeing a lot of growth in terms of the number of papers coming in, the number of downloads, the number of sites, and that growth shows to us the need to increase our reviewers. And part of this need is that as a field, no matter what university you're at in the world, you've probably felt more pressure now than maybe 5 or 10 years ago to publish and to hit higher quality journals as more schools are putting that pressure on hitting higher level journals. One of the joys of our field is truly that co-creation nature. I know as an author, I've had papers that when it comes out in print, it's a better paper because of the input I've gotten from reviewers. That pair of fresh eyes, that's something that seemed, self-evident, really needed more explanation. Or maybe I needed more details in an area. And as authors, we want people to review our work. And so you think about for every paper you submit to a journal, they're getting a couple of reviewers. And so be part of the solution in serving as a reviewer. But there's also benefits for doing this work, because it is a lot of work to review an article. That to do a good review will probably take you 4 to 8 hours. One, it's a service activity that truly has an impact, that you're impacting the field, you're helping colleagues. Two, it gives you insight into how journals work, what the process is. When we get the reviewers will get a letter. Here's our decision. Here's what the reviewers said. So you can see how other people in the field saw the same paper that you reviewed. And in doing that, it helps make you a better author. And one, because you're seeing the latest articles, the latest research that's coming out in the field. And two, because you're getting a feel for how the process works and how other reviewers and associate editors are looking at a manuscript. It can also help by looking at different articles. You can see where contributions are needed, where there's a gap, where the field can be advanced. And finally, there's opportunities for recognition that we have ERB Reviewer of the Year Award. We have an Ad Hoc Reviewer of the Year Award. Every December, we ask our associate editors to recommend ad hoc reviewers to be added to the editorial review board. It gives you a chance to make connections and get involved with the field. And for those of you that are perhaps early in your career, you may want to consider Publix. So that way you get recognition for your review work. And when you go up for your annual evaluations or when you go up for promotion or tenure, you can demonstrate I made an external contribution that advanced the field. Now I'm going to turn it over to Steve to talk more specifically about some suggestions for reviewing.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us. So it's really important with reviews to try and think about if the paper can progress. What is it that you can find in the paper that can make it publishable rather than what is wrong with the paper? So I like to try and start with a positive mindset. But in terms of you responding to reviews, it's very, very quickly. Even if the answer is no, it's okay to say no. If you need a bit more time, be proactive and ask. So somebody said to me, editors like two kinds of people, those that say yes or no quickly, and the worst is those that say yes and never do anything. So even if you haven't got time, let us know quickly. We're not going to blacklist you or anything like that. We can quickly find somebody else. So that's the first thing I'd point to make about is responding quickly to review requests. It is really important to think about your fellow authors or think about you when you're waiting for a paper to be reviewed. Now, as I said earlier, it's really important to try and see in your review if it's possible that the paper could be improved. What are the strengths and weaknesses of the paper? As young academics, we sometimes find that they are, a little bit more critical, which is fine, but try and find what you think are the strengths and weaknesses. In other words, try and have a balanced approach. try to address each major section of the paper. If you're unsure how to review, what you might do is go through each part of the paper. Provide suggestions for improving research, even if you're going to reject the paper. So it's not good enough to say this paper isn't up to standard. You really should be saying to the author, how is it useful? What can they do to improve the paper? I get a lot of rejections, and I find that rejections from a journal then help me reposition that paper for a new journal. So really try and put yourself in the author's shoes or reply to them. So a couple of points. If I don't know someone's title, I always address them as professor. And I always try and use a respectful tone. We're all authors ourselves. Be professional. Make sure your review is clearly written, understandable, to the point. It's not really about showing how clever you are, although you may be very clever. It's really about trying to help the author if you can. Keep in mind that journals have a worldwide research audience. So if the paper is talking about brand equity in Tasmania, how does that relate to brand equity in India or the United States or Greece? It's not about you, it's about the research. And that's the other thing to think about. How can we improve this? And really good journals that I've worked with from the point of view as authors have really tried to have taken that approach. What is it in the research that can be moved forward? All right, Jackie, so next slide. Thanks. Utilize the comments to the editor section. This is really important. If you are a little bit frustrated, your opinioning or frustrations should not go to the author. They should go to the editor. People's heart and soul sometimes goes into these papers, and it might be a terribly written paper. It might have missed key aspects in the literature. You might find it impossible to follow. Put those frustrations, if you have them, to the comments in the editor, which the authors don't see. For example, if you didn't make comments about the methodology analysis, the editors need to know if this is what you thought the section was fine or not. And be upfront. This is if the area is not your primary area of research. That's really important. So very rarely do reviewers review in their primary area. Part of our discipline is it's an applied theories come from different areas. There are different techniques you'll use. So you may be asked to review in something related to it. But if it's not your primary area, please let us know. Please let your editor know. Set the process through if you agree to review. So if you don't just do one review, you might do 2 or 3 for the same paper. The good news is if the authors respond, it gets gradually easier for you to be the reviewer. But it's really one of our biggest problems is the sort of dropout, and many journals have this as well. That somebody says, well, I've reviewed the paper once, I don't want to review it again. That means bringing in another reviewer who hasn't seen the paper, and the process kind of starts again. Focus very much when the next review comes back on whether the concerns were addressed and or the revision created new issues. So here what you're looking for is not, I found this, which I should have mentioned earlier. What you're saying is in the revised paper, have they revised it correctly? Have they addressed your concern? And does it array? Are there any new issues? And be a reviewer, you would like to review your manuscripts. In other words, if you were to get positive, not positive, but helpful reviews, what kind of language, what kind of approach would you be? And so I always think, even if I reject a paper, I often will say suggestions for future work. This paper is not really there, but it's a really promising area. Hang in there, but you really should address these issues. Okay, so next slide, please, Jackie. So what is JCB looking for with reviews? Well, in one word, quality. Firstly, does the review demonstrate a thorough understanding of the manuscript? Is there expertise in the topic and method? the first thing is thoroughness is a really important part of reviewing because it helps the author. It helps you improve the paper. Thoroughness isn't writing a lot of words necessarily, but it's identifying the key strengths and weaknesses of the paper. Does the review help the author move the research forward? This is a really important point. You're not just talking about, oh, well, this experiment's not right. You might say, well, maybe another experiment could resolve the difficulty that in this experiment. So you might talk about that. So how can you, the suggestions, just like if you're supervising a doctoral student, how can you help them move there forward? So constructive comments are always useful rather than what's wrong with the paper, what can people do to fix it? Really important in our discipline to be collegial, even if the decision is to reject. So encouraging people, telling them that the research is not ready, but they should hang in there. So I reviewed a paper on First Nations perspectives in market research. Great area to do. Terrible paper, unfortunately. Now, I didn't say a terrible paper to the authors, but what I did, I won't mention the journal, not this one, was I said, this is a really important area of research and you should keep doing work, but it's not quite there yet. You need to follow these suggestions. Reflect on the journal that you're working for. A poorly review really hurts the journal. So we've had, you know, we do our best and we look at review comments, but sometimes Jackie and I and the other associate editors get one-line reviews back like, this paper is terrible, or you haven't addressed my concern. You need to say, if the second and third round, why have you not addressed the concerns? Why is that? Is the review a sufficient quality for an A-level journal or above, right? So reviewing, we should take reviewing as seriously as we do in writing papers, putting grant applications in, teaching all those core aspects of our business. Because if you're a really good reviewer, it will make you a better author. And it will also help you build a great professional network. And that's something that I think people really need to think about, particularly young academics. All right, Jackie, next slide. Okay, so thoroughness is really important here. Aim for at least 100 words per section. Point out the positive aspects as well as the issues. Try and address the sections. Also good if you find something that's really good in the paper, say it's really good. So if somebody's got a really good literature review and it falls down a little bit in the method, we'll say the literature review is really good, right? So, I mean, just you don't have to not say something is bad to give a review. A review is also, if you think about somebody reviewing a movie or a play or a concert, it's the same thing. If something is really good, say that. It really does help authors, particularly if their paper is not accepted in the end. So it's vital to communicate these issues to authors and to editors in response to editors, and any feedback to editors, major concerns, confidential. Do not just copy and paste your responses to the authors. So what you say to the editors is a private conversation that's really about the author's paper. Okay, and it's sort of a nutshell. And why are we doing that? Because as reviewers, we're trying to help the associate editors, right? And if you're helping the associate editors, they'll help you one day and the whole system works a lot better. So thoroughness is really, really important in this space. Thanks, Jackie. Next slide. Timeliness is the other thing. Now, many of us have waited, you know, for tenure reviews, for that promotion, and we haven't got that paper, and it's very, very frustrating. So with the first review, what thing we look at here is, do they respond quickly to the initial request? We do send out reminders, submit the review by the deadline. So meeting deadlines in this job is particularly important. If you can't meet a deadline, you're sick, a lot of people are getting sick at the moment, or there are issues pop up, just let the editor know, right? We're not grumpy people. Things like that happen all the time. And communicate in a timely manner to try and minimize any possible delays. Likewise with revisions, and this is really an issue for a lot of journals. Do they respond quickly? And I think if you've agreed to review a paper, when it comes back to the second stage, you should respond quickly. Unless something's happened and you can't be part of the review process, let us know earlier. Submit the review by the deadline. Stick with the review process through multiple rounds until a final decision has been made. Is particularly important. And you need to communicate any delays that you have. We can move deadlines around, but obviously what we want to do is we want to respond to authors as quickly as possible. And the journal keeps a lot of performance metrics on Jackie and I and the associate editors to be nice to authors. And I think that's a good thing. Next slide, please. So what then happens? Well, associate editors then will summarize the major reviews, highlights the concerns, and may provide additional guidance on how to meet that, or might note that there are actually some fatal flaws which might mean that the paper needs to be recast. So what are the deciding factors? Well, contribution is the key thing, the novelty of the contribution or newness of the study. And by that, we don't mean it's in a different country or it's an unusual industry. Really, it's an advance of theory and practice that we're looking at. And so that's really the second part there. So citing the literature from the journal is very important part of that. The quality of the research, how the rigor, the methodological rigor. We're finding a lot of papers now don't mention the sample or how they collected the data. We really find that very frustrating because you should be able to replicate that study. Associators then will recommend rejecting the paper, revision, major or minor. Most revisions tend to be major, except it's rare with the initial review as most manuscripts go through sort of an improvement round. But the odds are that if you get a revision with most journals, particularly this one, if you're following diligently what reviewers want, your chances are pretty good. And that's, as a reviewer, you should be thinking like that as well. Okay, so next slide, please, Jackie.
Oh, do the associate editors, do you have anything you would like to add? Okay, I'll move on.
All right. Now, handling revisions as a reviewer, the response to the reviewer's letter. So one we're looking at here is we're looking for good faith effort to discuss your concerns. Now, an author doesn't need to agree, but they've got to address them. They can't just say, D'Alessandro, you're wrong. That's not addressing it. They might say, we've taken a different approach to D'Alessandro. We have used, I don't know, best worst scaling rather than traditional conjoint analysis for these reasons. Now, the second comment doesn't necessarily take my comments on board, but they've tried to address them. How do they address it? So again, people should be highlighting where they are in papers. What I'm doing now as an author is I'm using a different font or a highlight, so I make it clear where the changes are. If they could not address the concern, did they provide sound reasoning, which I talked about earlier? Would the change contradict the other reviewers' editor suggestions? Now, this is one to be careful of. A response from an author is, well, reviewer one says this, and reviewer two says this. I'm going to do what reviewer two says, but reviewer one's wrong. They can't both be right. In this case, the author should be asking for guidance from the associate editor if there is such a difference. And what you should be looking at for a reviewer is usually you're looking at your concerns at that time, but you will pick up other concerns that the reviewer that the author makes. Do they summarize the major changes? So if there are a lot of changes, and I had this recently from the Journal of Marketing, I'm still going through this review process, they actually wanted to see a highlight. I thought this was quite good, of bullet points of the major changes. So before you go through line by line, a good response will have, these are the major changes, and you just go from bullet point. Referring to page numbers, paragraph numbers, or line numbers also helps this. Okay. Did they make substantive improvements? Or are, as some reviewers would say, cosmetic? Okay. We really want to see papers improve. That's the whole purpose of the review process, particularly if people have got revisions. Okay. Now, yeah, different font, I think, is probably the best way. Highlighting yellow is another, but telling people also it's been highlighted in blue, or it's, it's a blue font, or it's in yellow. So now that we're seeing things on screens rather than printing them out, it's a lot easier. Do the changes improve it? So again, your decision as the reviewer when the paper comes back, is it a better paper? If it's not, then you've still got concerns. Or does it create these new changes, new concerns? So if the fact that somebody's done an additional study, an experiment, and it shows now that the main effect in the first experiment, or the mediation moderation, is no longer there, what does that say about the original hypothesis? Okay. Are more revisions still needed to improve the manuscript? And yeah, usually there'll be a couple of rounds before we go through. And as with the issue, please discuss this by section. Again, what needs to be done to get the paper to a publishable standard. So let the author know is that if there is no further, if you're happy, okay, and tell them you're happy, okay, but they are not understanding your concerns, please clarify. And again, don't say, I stand by my review comments. That was one of the reviews comments I had from one reviewer. You can't say that. Say, I note what you've said. You've done all this, a lot of work, but I think you've really just missed really what I'm asking you to help improve the paper. Discuss what is needed if there are substantive changes. Be clear. Put them in bullet points sometimes. The revision now makes a fatal flaw apparent. Communicate how they can move forward with their research, even if it's not in this journal. So this is an important point. We have an ability now within the Wiley stable of journals that we're in to move papers to where they might be a better fit. And sometimes we get papers that come in with flaws from other journals. And unfortunately, people don't take that paper away, improve it, and then send it back to us. So really getting a rejection isn't always a bad thing if you're getting really valuable feedback, okay? They made a good faith effort, but the research is not a JCB quality. Be constructive to aid them, right? So this is right. This is an important area. You're nearly there. Hang in there. We would be interested in a new paper in the future, but you're not quite there. So really, it's really about helping your colleagues, if in a nutshell. What would you be saying to them over a cup of coffee if they were just asking for some review here? Any comments from the associate editors for the next section? No? I'll move on, shall I? Now, the role of the associate editor is to make sure the reviewer's comments are adequately addressed by the authors to the reviewer's satisfaction. Revisions made by the authors and concerns addressed deciding factors. Now, a reviewer advises an associate editor. This is important to note. So often, the reviews are clear and there's a consensus. So the associate editor has a fairly clear picture of whether the paper is acceptable or not. However, the associate editor can make a decision that is different to one or two of the reviewers. It's quite possible, right? They can say, well, maybe I'll get another reviewer because this review wasn't quite there. Just missed the point. So the associate editor decides really in the end if your paper is acceptable or not. The reviewers are provided important advisory, but they're not the decision maker, right? They're not the people who move the paper to the next section, next stage of the review process. It's the associate editor. And they, as you say, can make the following changes which are shown there. Okay, and normally they'll combine. Also, if there is disagreement amongst the reviewers, if one reviewer is very transient or, determine that their concerns have not been met, what an associate editor will often do is provide the guidance, hopefully, to the reviewer, to the author about how they might meet that paper. So again, it's a very collegiate, collaborative process, and associate editors, like reviewers and editors-in-chief, all want good papers. Okay, Jackie, next slide, please.
So I'll jump in here with our conclusion that I think as you're looking at a paper as a reviewer, you want to look at it as the things you look to do as an author. That, quality reviews are looking for quality papers, that you want to look for things. Is there that theoretical grounding of the research? Does the manuscript demonstrate knowledge of the literature? Where do the authors get their data from? Is that clear? Who's that sample? What was measured? How exactly was it measured? Were there multi-studies? At JCB, we are now encouraging more multi-studies, ideally multi-methods. And what we're looking for, and what you need to be looking for as a reviewer, is, does the paper go beyond just students or MTurk samples, go beyond just measuring attitudes or intentions, to the idea that, does this manuscript advance the field? Does it make an impact? Does it make a contribution? And finally, good copy editing can always help a paper. So those are things that you're going to be looking for as a reviewer. Journals need quality reviewers, and quality reviews are what help advance the knowledge in our field. It's the work of the authors, as well as the suggestions of the reviewers, that really do help advance knowledge in the field. We're looking to grow our reviewer base. Our goal is to broaden our base of ad hoc reviewers, with the idea of, these are ad hoc reviewers that can be developed into editorial review board members in the future. And we're looking for people with a variety of knowledge of different consumer behavior topics or different methodologies. I think a real strength of the journal is, while yes, we focus on consumer behavior, we're not a sales journal or strategy journal, but within consumer behavior, and you can see this when you look at the website and look at all the different special papers, we have a very broad tent in the field of consumer behavior. So you might say, oh, I have a very niche area. Well, we're still interested in you reviewing for us when we get papers in that niche. Or it might be you don't have a specialty in terms of topics, but you're more of a strong methods person. Well, that also can be a great contribution to the journal. And we're very interested in getting early scholars involved in the process. So if you're interested in getting involved, you can either email us, and our emails are on the next slide, or if you're like, can I just tell you now? In the chat function, if you could give us your name, your email address, what university you're with, and perhaps 2 to 3 areas of interest, whether they be in topics or methodology. We'll compile that list and send that out to our associate editors. And we can't thank you enough for your time. Everyone is busy, between classes and research and other obligations. So we greatly appreciate you taking the time to be with us. And here's our contact information. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it over to Raj to talk about any questions. If you have any questions, if you'd like to type them in the chat, but I'll turn it over to Raj now. Oh, Raj, you need to unmute.
Hi, Jackie and Steve and everyone present at the discussion. So we have, in the last 2 minutes, there's like 4 questions that popped up. So the first question is, how do AEs decide if the manuscript needs a major versus a minor revision? And if the other AEs don't mind, I will make the first pass at it. So I think this is a neat question. It comes from Purvi Shah, and Purvi, I just called your name out, so apologize if we didn't want your name to be called out. But I think this is a neat question. A lot of times what happens is, as an AE, you're first reading the manuscript before it goes out for review. And you have in mind certain folks who you think will do a good job because it's in their domain of interest. Once the feedback comes in, and this is kind of a mixed bag, right? So folks who are from typically in the North America, maybe Australia, the reviews are a little more, I would like to use the word not soft. I think the folks from the emerging markets, the reviews are much softer. What do I mean by soft? As in, they are really nice, as in they don't want to hurt the feelings of anyone. So they would have concerns, but they would call it a minor revision. Whereas the same would, coming out of North America, would probably say, this is a major revision. Or they might even say it's a reject. And again, it's a function of how you look at things. So as a AE, the first thing we look for is the extent of the feedback that the reviewer has provided. And then go back to the manuscript, kind of read if that really holds true, and then make a call whether it is actually major or minor. The whole objective is to help the author through the publication process. So a lot of times, especially folks who look at things like methodology, right? A lot of times methodology sometimes gets hidden. Some aspects of the research gets hidden. And if the AE is kind of proficient in that area, he or she would immediately know what is being hidden. And at that time, you kind of highlight that in the review and say, hey, this is a major revision, but you need to say this. And so I think I'll give you an example, right? The most recent one is common method bias. Every paper brings up the issue of common method bias. And a lot of papers have common method bias. Now, common method bias is not a bad thing, but the thing is, how have you addressed it? So rather than saying we don't have common method bias, but when an AE looks at it and thinks that there is common method bias, as of this, you just want that addressed more than anything else. So the AE might point out as that being a major revision because it's not been addressed. Whereas somebody else might look at it as, oh, they addressed the issue of common method bias and probably call it a minor revision. So again, it's a judgment call, but most of the times it's something that the AE has seen it multiple times and so decides whether it's a major or a minor revision. Does that answer your question?
Varsha or Zach, is there anything else you'd like to add? Oh, Steve, if you can unmute Varsha and Zach. And while he's unmuting, I'm gonna, Raj said something that brought up a point that I wanted to make is, as authors, when you're handling a revision, yes, you need to address point by point the reviewer's comments, and you want to put the reviewer's comments in full. Don't just put a little like one word or one line summary of it. Put it in full. Do not make that reviewer go back to their original write-up. But also when you're addressing comments, the AEs are giving you comments. So when you address your revisions as an author and that response to reviewers that top part as authors should be sort of a summary of the major changes made, then sort of a discussion of how you address what the AE asked you to address, and then point by point how you address the authors. And I think we have Zach unmuted, and
Yep.
Steve, if you could also unmute Varsha. So Zach, anything else to follow up?
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Jackie. And I thought Raj actually did an excellent job of answering that question to begin with. When I put myself in the associate editor's shoes and I'm thinking about the paper, I really think the difference between a major and a minor revision is how much of the extent is there required? How much work is there required to get this paper from what it currently is, what the original submission is, to something that could end up being something accepted and published within the Journal of Consumer Behaviour? So if it's something that I don't think will end up getting there, well, then I'm going to recommend a rejection. And of course, that has to be nicely written, very constructive, because ultimately you want to help this person better their research and further their careers, even if it is publishing that research elsewhere. So make sure you give constructive feedback. If I think it's going to require more than one round of revision, which is reasonably common, then I sort of err on the side of major revisions. And that's usually something that's kind of not a fundamental flaw that would make it rejection worthy, but something that there's a big part of the literature that's missing, or maybe there's something that's actually wrong that can actually be changed with the methodology or the interpretation of the results. Now, I then look at minor revisions as things that are, spelling and grammatical mistakes, maybe missing one or two different papers, a little twinge to the results of the analysis and the interpretation, things that can probably get changed around one round of revision. So for me, major revision, generally I'm signaling to you it's going to take multiple rounds from the reviewers and from the authors. Minor revisions are usually just the one. So that's kind of my perspective.
Thank you, Zach. Now, Varsha, did you have anything to add? And Steve, is Varsha unmuted on your end? No, yeah, Varsha needs to be unmuted, Steve.
Oh, I thought I unmuted you. My apologies. Okay, so let's just try you again. How's that, Varsha? There you go.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I think I agree with what Jackie and Steve and Zach and Raj were discussing. To build more on the discussion, I just wanted to mention that, when we put up a decision of a major revision or a minor revision, the whole idea is, as Steve, mentioned it earlier, that the biggest issue that we are facing and we look into the papers is the contributions that you're making to consumer behavior area. So if you talk about AI, ML, everything, that's great. But then how does that connect with CB? That is something which is very important for the journal. So how you are extending the discipline, how you're making, creating the new knowledge and building upon that tourism, the entire knowledge of the CB area. I think that is really very important, which we look into. And if there are no contributions per se, then unfortunately, we will have to reject the manuscript. So I think 90% of the manuscripts are getting rejected because of contributions. So here we also see contributions to theory and practice. And the other issue when there is a revision and the authors are getting back with a revision, there are two stages which we face as an AE. And that is that one track is when the authors are actually making all the suggestions and making all the edits in the manuscripts and undertaking all the suggestions provided by the reviewers. And sometimes I think our entire board would agree that many a times there is always a dilemma. So we go for a third review then. For example, one person says reject, another person says minor revision. And when we look at the manuscript, you feel that you need one more review. So we actually put in a lot of effort to get the third review done. And that actually helps us to take a decision that whether this will go for a reject, for a major revision. And when we decide the reviewers, I think Steve and Jackie has mentioned is we look into methodological experts, we look into subject experts, as well as if it is technological area, this is the triad which we kind of, or sort of try to develop among the reviewers, so that it's a combination of all the areas, if that is related to that, discipline, or it is interdisciplinary area. We also try to get reviewers from other discipline as well, because CB is a very interdisciplinary area. It works as sociology, technology, and psychology as well. So that is the kind of efforts that we put in, and probably the whole idea is to give a constructive feedback to the author so that they can come up with a better manuscript, and then depending upon your revision, we take a decision whether you have addressed all the comments properly, you're making contributions. And then sometimes what we feel as an AE is that, most of the comments which are being provided by the reviewers are being addressed, and sometimes they are not. So then, as Steve has mentioned earlier, you need to provide justification for us to take a decision why it was not possible. And if you provide a better justification and contextualize it well, then actually it helps us to take the decision. And then sometimes we go for a major revision because from, like R&R, you may get into major revision. And for the minor revision, I think it's a very, not a major kind of a contribution issue, but as Zach has mentioned, it could be something around the manuscript which can be corrected very easily by the authors, and you're making a significant contribution. So that is pretty less, because primarily you will have to get down to the manuscript and make those contributions. But my larger worry is that we have a lot of submission, but it is very disheartening to see when people are submitting to JCB and not even realizing, as Steve has mentioned at the beginning, you might have made a submission at a journal, not making the changes even in the abstract, and making a submission at the journal. And that is something which is very disheartening to see, because if you are submitting to a journal, you need to follow the guidelines. For example, some of the papers, we do the Dex rejections as an AE also, because we get 55 pages of manuscripts. Now, the journal has clearly mentioned the word limit, so probably those are certain areas you have to keep in mind also while as the author and also as a reviewer, because when you are connecting yourself to JCB, then probably these are certain parameters which will be helping the journal to scale up. So just wanted to explain how we take the decisions as the AE. Thank you, Steve and Jackie.
Thank you so much. Raj, is there other questions?
So there's an interesting couple of questions actually.
Okay.
One is and I found this interesting, as in, what is the right way to address comments that the authors consider does not make sense because they're impossible to address at that point? Change the sample or point out to things outside the scope of the study.
Well, I think when that happens, as an author, you need to look at that the reviewer offered those comments in good faith. Now, if it's a case of you're not understanding what exactly it is that they're asking you to do, that's where reach out to the AE, ask for clarifications. If they're asking you to do things as an author where it would make the paper a totally different paper. I remember with Hanju Shin, her AMS webinar about reviewing, I remember O.C. Farrell saying, at the bottom line, you're the author, it's your paper. So if you feel that's a case that to make that change would make this a totally different paper, I think you can still address the comments respectfully. You may want to reach out to the AE. Do they feel this is a critical area that has to be addressed? Because sometimes authors will say, no, I don't want to do that. I don't want to collect another study. Well, as an author, I collect other studies, do another study. So when somebody asks you to do another study, that's not an insult. That's this will help the contribution of the paper. It feels, it's hard as an author to get it, but I know on multiple of my papers that have hit journals that we've collected more data, because to better make your case. So I think you need to first, as an author, come from the perspective of this was made in good faith by the reviewer, but if clarifications are needed, reach out in advance. And if the change would make the paper better, then do it. If the change would make the paper worse, make the case for why you can't make the change. But if it would make the paper better, do it. Anyone else have?
I think just
No,
to add to
Jackie,
that, go ahead.
Raj, if I can share like quickly in 30 seconds an example to back it up with Jackie. So probably like in one of the case, as an author I'm sharing, I was doing some studies in India, which is an emerging market for luxury branding. And the reviewers asked me, well, how do you justify it and about the sample? And you need to contextualize it because there is bottom of the pyramid as well. Why don't you collect the data? Well, that is not the sample of my study. So I provide a contextualization and justification for my samples, and they accepted it. So it's not also about, getting more data, but as Jackie mentioned, I actually cited this, my own example, because it helped at times to provide a justification why you're not doing. And if you're adding more sample, then it should add some quality in your manuscript. Yeah, Raj.
Excellent point. And I think let's move on to the next question, if that is okay. All right.
Yeah, sure.
I want to make sure that we get through all the questions. Would be grateful to hear speakers' thoughts on developing or emerging market context to JCB.
You want to answer that, Jackie, or Raj?
Okay, go. I think emerging markets is an important topic, but I think in addressing emerging markets, it has to go beyond, I've looked at one specific country, that the contribution has to be broader than that. And so emerging markets are vital to study in consumer behavior. But I think as authors, you have to take care in contextualizing what you're specifically looking at and how that makes a contribution to the field.
Yeah, look, I echo this. Often we will see people who said, look, no one's looked at this kind of research in a country. And that in itself is not a contribution. What is it about the culture, the background, the way the consumers make decisions that is different in this country to what is accepted in research? So most of the research, as we know, is in Western countries. If you're finding that in China, so for example, there's lots of examples of research in China and India, which have more collective cultures or more family-oriented cultures where decision-making is quite different. Now you're starting to make a contribution to consumer behavior practice. But if you just say, I've collected data in India or China or Africa and no one's really done this, that's not a contribution. So you need to think clearly about what is the contribution to theory and practice in general, given what you found in your study. Okay, so don't be in a rush just to replicate something from one country to another. It's not really a contribution. All right. But yeah, it is interesting. Getting back to luxury branding, which Varsha talks about, quite different motivations in countries like China or India compared to Western countries. So yes, it is worth looking at these markets, and these are valuable markets. But just to say I've done luxury research in India and no one's really done it, that's not a contribution. And so that's what we're looking about, right?
So quickly, Raj, if I can cite an example of my own work, just to add the clarity. as you talk about emerging markets, I do most of my studies from emerging markets. So I would back up all the points that Jackie and Steve has mentioned with the example. So we developed an integrated model of luxury consumption with the identity of the self of an individual as the consumer. And then we talk about the different levels of the luxury consumptions where the people are doing, and the context was emerging markets, but the contributions were on the consumption area. So I think this is what we are trying to say, that if you're extending the knowledge and taking it further into the CB area and talking about, hey, you spoke about all these in silos, and let me integrate and provide you a better model which can talk about the consumption and identity in luxury consumption in a better way, that makes sense. And that's how, that paper also got published. So that's the whole idea. It's about contextualization. That is one. See, I'll tell you, coming from the emerging market as a scholar, the most of the problem arises how you conceptualize the research. Our focus should be on the concepts and not on the context as a first primary research idea. And if you do that well, your entire project and manuscript will do a better job in the A-level journal like JCB. So Raj, over to you.
Thank you, Varsha. Okay, this is kind of a neat comment. This I'm going to read. It's slightly long, but it's a neat comment. Okay. Thank you for organizing this session. Very helpful tips. Like JCB, many leading journals, example JAMS, underline the developmental soul of reviewers. That is being positive, constructive, and provide specific recommendations for the issues. I find this is very helpful as an author. Here comes the question. But as a reviewer, I find it difficult to define the thin line between providing specific recommendations about how to address the issue and being author-centric, or let the authors lead the way. It would be helpful to get the JCB take on it.
I think that you raise a good point. I guess my perspective of it is the more information you can provide the author, the more helpful it is to the author. I always sort of revert back to what would be helpful to me as an author in writing a review. So let's say someone misses key parts of the literature. If you say you miss key parts of the literature, okay, that's helpful. But if you say you miss key parts of the literature, specifically, here are the sites you need to really go into and look for additional articles like these, that's more helpful. And something else to think about is, this isn't a multiple choice question where there's one right answer, that there's multiple approaches. So you can, if you can offer that as a reviewer, say this needs to be addressed. There are different ways to address it. You could do this, you could do this, you could do this, but this needs to be addressed somehow. And I've seen reviewers do that. Say this is a weakness. There's more than one way to address it. Do what you think works best for the paper. I think that type of feedback is also very helpful.
Yeah, I'd echo those things. Really, what you're trying to do as a reviewer is to say, if the paper is to find merit in the paper, if you can. Now, if you can't find merit, well, that's you've got to say so. But try and say, in a positive way, what would bring the paper up to a standard that you think would be acceptable. So it's really about helping and guiding, almost teaching in a way, the author of the paper. Okay, Varsha, you were going to say something.
Yeah, so I just wanted to add on to what Jackie and Steve were saying, Raj, that, as an AE, when we get the reviews, as if you can help the authors constructively, and assuming yourself to be an author to say that here are certain set of things which you can do in order to improvise the manuscript for contributions for theory. This is where, say, for example, the manuscript is all about consumer perception, and somehow the authors have spoken about, consumer motivation, which could be the secondary objective. So if you say that, your objective have to be clear. I'm just citing examples for the point to make it clear so that, it would be better for the people to understand the reviewing style and the writing part of it when you write up the review. So if you just say that, we need more clear objectives, if that is first line of review, and instead of that, if you say that your manuscript seems to be more about the consumer motives rather than the perceptions, then this is how you have actually nailed it down to this particular area. And this seems to be your second objective, which could be repositioned in this way. Probably as an AE, we would prefer the second style of the reviewing, where you are actually helping the authors to actually make those improvisations in the manuscript. So those are the reviewers which are very helpful for improvising the manuscript as well as the journal. Raj?
If I could just build on
Zach.
that quickly, I'll make it nice and short because I know we're running out of time. I think ultimately when you're reviewing for the journal, be the reviewer as an author that you wish you had. You submit to a journal, you go through it, you put your heart and soul into this. This is not just a piece of work. It's not just a job. Most of us are building careers, so it means a lot to us. We spend years doing this. Even if it has flaws, constructively help that person. Make sure you write constructively, write positively, try to be that person that can help them take it from here to here and get that published. So that's ultimately what I would want from the reviewers when I'm looking at them is, are you working with them to make their paper better?
As a general rule of thumb, to add to Zach's point, and that is spot on, Zach. That's exactly how I perceive any review. Is first thing I look at it as, can I fix it? And if that is the case, if I can fix it, then I'm going to tell you what are the things that you need to do in order to the steps that you need to take to make it see the public, the accept part of the manuscript. And if I think it's going to be a challenge, or if it needs another round of data collection, I'm going to be upfront and tell you there's a fatal flaw here. You need to do this in order to see this make it to JCB. And so, yeah, I absolutely agree. I think as reviewers, the first thing you want is you want feedback that you as an author would like to receive. And so I would encourage all the reviewers to provide feedback in the same way that they would like for if they were authors of a manuscript. So thank you. Yeah. Couple other quick some of the folks, well, definitely they have shared their email addresses and would like to be ad hoc reviewers. And then there's a couple of requests for if the slides and or the video recording can be made available.
Our plan is I'll send the slides to the journal and have them post the slides up, and then we'll go through the video and post the video. We'll ask the journal to post the video on the slot on the website. The slides, I'll send them the slides today. It'll probably take us a little longer to edit the video because we started recording as people were coming in before we started talking. So that will probably take a little bit longer, but I'll share the slides with Wiley and ask them to post them on the website today. And also, if people want to just send me an email and say, can you send me the slides? I can just send you the slides directly. So that's no problem at all. Anything else, Raj?
That's pretty much it. I mean, most of the comments are about receiving the slides or their interest in being an ad hoc reviewer. So,
well, great. We greatly appreciate everyone's time. We greatly appreciate everyone's participation in the journal. We hope that this past hour that you've spent with us has helped illuminate what JCB and other journals look for with this. But we also hope that seeing the review side of it gets you interested in getting involved in the field, getting involved with JCB, but also help you as an author to see this other side. So we hope we've been helpful both in terms of as a potential reviewer and as a potential author, and look forward to you getting involved with JCB. Steve, anything else before we sign off, or any of the AEs?
Oh, no, only just thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate it. And if you have any suggestions about special issues or where you'd like the journal to move forward to, we're always happy to hear from authors about that as well. Thank you very much.
Anything from the AEs, Zach, Varsha, or Raj?
So I just wanted to mention that thank you so much. This being a very lovely session. Thank you so much for your interest in the journal and being with us for the last 1 hour. And we love to look forward to and working with you as the reviewers. So we appreciate your time. So
Sure. Yep. Thanks everyone for your time this evening for me. And yeah, I look forward to working with you as reviewers and yeah, building up what is an amazing journal already under the leadership of Jackie and Stephen. You can quite clearly see the journal has come leaps and bounds, and it's very exciting to be part of it. So come and join our team.
Thanks for showing up for the session, folks. And yeah, if you have any further questions, feel free to shoot us an email and we'll be more than happy to answer.
Thank you all so much. So for those of you, that's good morning. I know you probably have a huge to-do list to jump to. Same for those for good afternoon, and for those good evening. Particularly those in Australia, it's probably getting very close to saying good night. So thank you all so much for coming. We can't thank you enough for your interest and your participation